My first guest this week is Seth Barron. He is the managing editor of The American Mind and author of a new book, The Last Days of New York. The book is due out at the beginning of June, and I invited him on to talk about his book and the problems New York City is facing. Here's the first segment of our interview. Seth, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Charles. I'm glad to be here.
Well, you have a new book out called The Last Days of New York. The best question to start off with is, what made you write this book?
You know, I've been following New York City politics pretty closely over the last, 10, 15 years, writing about it. And when de Blasio came in, he came in with a whole wave of progressive legislators, too. And, the thing is, New York City is a pretty liberal democratic place, and it has been for decades. Sure, okay, we had a couple of mayors who were, Republicans or centrist types. But generally speaking, the ruling class in New York is pretty liberal. So it's interesting what made these people progressive. So I paid close attention to their policies, to what de Blasio was up to. And it seemed as though he was set on tracking a new course in regard to public safety, in regard to opportunity, to education, to business, small business and big business. And it seemed like their approach wasn't necessarily, it didn't seem like it was going to lead to bearing good fruit. And then, once the pandemic hit, it became clear that things were taking a bad turn and that the city was not ready, that he had undermined a lot of the strengths of New York City to the point where when something bad happened, we no longer had the underpinnings, the strong foundation to withstand like adverse winds, if that makes sense.
No, it does. And the majority of our interview is going to be about what is currently happening in New York. You write a lot about de Blasio specifically, but I think we should finish this segment kind of setting it up in a sense, to the people who will listen who aren't from New York, aren't in New York, haven't been in New York, who will say things are bad. I see some of the news, some of the things on the periphery, but they'll say, what is different about, you just said the city has always been kind of liberal and democratic city. So what is different about these progressives? What is different about de Blasio? Because there's always been great things about New York that draws people to New York, the nightlife, the restaurants, international cities, the museums, all this stuff. But there's always been an underbelly. There was a seedy part of town. There was, you go all the way back. You can talk about Tammany Hall. You can talk about corruption for years, kind of like Chicago, where I came from. We had some things similar there. And then in recent years, you can go back to Dinkins, and you can go back to other mayors who weren't very effective. But you talk about that a bit in your book, how what they inherited was also different from what de Blasio inherited. So talk about the differing problems in New York and why they are unique here under de Blasio's.
For sure. Well, people talk about who is the worst mayor in New York City history. And certainly since World War II, two mayors have stood out, and that's Abe Beame and David Dinkins. Abe Beame ruled the city in the early 70s when it basically went into receivership. It couldn't meet its current obligations, and the state had to take over its finances. David Dinkins was mayor from 1990 through the end of 1993. And he saw murders peak at over 2,000 per year. So, neither of these were particularly effective or good mayors, but at the same time, they each inherited a terrible crisis. Abe Beame came in after years of escalating labor costs and the extension of the social welfare state. David Dinkins came in during the crack era. So they came in, they inherited a crisis. De Blasio came to power after 20 years of radical changes in public safety, where the murder rate had dropped from a high of over 2,000 in 1991 down to 500 or so, 400 a year. He came into a city that was the envy of other cities in the country and the world. We had 63 million foreign visitors a year. We had strong economic growth. We had a diversified economic base. It was essentially the envy of the world. And he set about essentially hollowing it out through ruinous public safety policies, an attack on the business sector. Essentially, that's what he came in with. And what he's going to leave with is a much worse situation.
Yeah. And I would say it's almost kind of like whatever you think of Dean and Dinkins, you can question some of their decisions. You can question their competency. But I don't think people would say that they were intentionally doing things to hurt the city, right? That, it's like any other politicians, for the most part, I assume positive intent. So for the most part, you're doing what you think is best for the most people, best for the citizens you represent. I don't think that necessarily holds for de Blasio.
Well, that's a very good point. And it kind of brings up the question of what is the mayor of de Blasio's real constituency? And we saw this, after the pandemic hit. Now, New York City saw worse unemployment and more sustained unemployment than anywhere else in the country. Now, throughout the entire time, all he talked about was the municipal workforce. New York City has about 330,000 municipal workers. That's up 10% from when he came in. He radically expanded the municipal workforce. And he spoke all the time about how he didn't want to lay off anyone. And all he talked about was how the municipal workers had to be made whole. No, it's fine. We don't want to see anybody lose their job. But the idea that the main concern of all New Yorkers was that the municipal workers, these are, say, teachers, garbage men, civil servants, librarians, the idea that they alone had to be preserved. It was a funny tell on de Blasio's part. New York City is a heavily unionized, its workforce is heavily unionized. That is, it's public employees. And the public employee unions have tremendous power. It basically became clear that political power, that de Blasio was beholden to these interests, and essentially whatever else happened wasn't really the point. There were times when people would ask him about the central business district in Manhattan, which is dead. I mean, to this day, it's still pretty dead. And he commented, well, he doesn't really see that as a major, that's not his primary concern. Now, the central business district of New York City, of Manhattan, is the driver of all of the tax revenue that the city gets to pay for its extensive welfare programs. I mean, this is something people don't appreciate, but de Blasio's entire focus has been on wealth inequality and income inequality. And sure, it might not be pleasant to think about some people making, millions of dollars a year while others are struggling to pay the rent and so forth. But at the same time, New York City has a very generous social welfare safety net, and it's the rich who pay for it. De Blasio always says that the rich aren't paying their fair share. Well, I mean, it depends what you mean by fair share, but, the top 1% of income earners in New York City, I think they pay something like 43% of the income taxes.
Seth mentioned what percentage of the taxes the wealthy pay, and don't take his word for it. I like to go to the governor himself at one of his award-winning press conferences during COVID, talking about COVID and the economy. And here's a clip of him talking about adding a new tax on the wealthy.
Our population 1% of the population pays 50% of the taxes.
Think about that clip whenever you hear someone talk about the rich paying their fair share. Coming up, more with Seth Barron, author of The Last Days of New York. You are listening to The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer.
Now, more of The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer, with your host, Charles Love.
Welcome back. I am continuing my conversation with Seth Barron, managing director at The American Mind and author of the new book, The Last Days of New York. In the first segment, we kind of did setup. We talked about past mayors, the problems in New York not being unique. They've always had problems. What's different about de Blasio and other supposedly failed mayors. But here we talk more about de Blasio, his background, his family, and how he got to be this woke politician before woke was hip. So in your book, you focus a lot on de Blasio, and the people who don't know New York as well, they still see the comments and hear the craziness, hear him saying stuff like, we got plenty of money, it's in the wrong hands, or eating Shake Shack on TV at a press conference, or he's painting BLM on the streets. But you get in deep. You talk about his policies a lot, his beliefs, but you talk about him from the beginning. So let's learn a little bit about the man who is running the biggest city in this country. All the antics aside, he has a streak in him that's fully socialist, right? So
yes, he does. It's interesting. Bill de Blasio was born Warren Wilhelm Jr.
When I read that, I was like, that's funny. I had no idea.
It is funny. And he changed his name twice. Now, his mother's maiden name was de Blasio. His mother's parents came from Italy. And he says that he always felt like he was closer to the Italian side. It's funny. At one point, he said that he changed his name after reading the autobiography of Malcolm X, in college, I think. And
he's like LeBron James. He probably got past page 6 stuff.
I think he may have read the whole thing. But it's kind of funny. So it's like, well, I guess what? So Warren Wilhelm was his slave name. So the de Blasios were an immigrant family. The Wilhelms came from Ohio. I mean, obviously it was like a German family. I don't know exactly when they came here, but Bill de Blasio likes the Italian side because it kind of shows this scrappy immigrant grit. The Wilhelm side is interesting. His grandfather went to Harvard and became Herbert Hoover's personal secretary. He interviewed William Howard Taft. He knew Theodore Roosevelt, of all people. I mean, he was kind of a schooled elite character. De Blasio's father went to Yale and met his mother in New York City in the 30s, and they got married. They were both of the left. It's not clear if they were actually communists or not, but they did belong to left-leaning organizations, as people did back then. His father went off to war in World War II and was grievously wounded. It sounds like his father was kind of a war hero, lost a leg. That didn't stop de Blasio when he was running for mayor from, I hate to say it, but he sort of threw his father under the bus and really talked him down and talked about his depression and his alcoholism. His parents were investigated for disloyalty after World War II. His mother had belonged to a communist front organization that, major progressive Democrats like Eleanor Roosevelt had decried. In any case, they were investigated and found not to be disloyal, but anyway, his father lost his security clearance, and it sort of destroyed his career as an intelligence officer or analyst, which I think is what he wanted. And his father wound up killing himself when de Blasio was about 10. So, it's a tragic story. De Blasio went to NYU, and he got very involved in the Central American Solidarity movement, in particular with support for the Sandinista regime in Nicaragua. He went to Nicaragua and did some kind of, I think he was unloading trucks and helping out with health and vaccination campaigns and things like that. It's funny, though, because later he saw a map in an office, in a Sandinista office, a neighborhood map with all of the houses identified. And he said he saw that he had an epiphany where he realized the power of government to reach into people's homes and help them and spread information. Now, of course, communist regimes do home visits routinely in the guise of spreading information and help, but really to check up on people and to indoctrinate them and make sure that everybody's marching in lockstep. So it's kind of funny because then de Blasio came to New York and became an organizer, and the whole progressive model of politics is based around this idea of the community organizer. And you saw this in Chicago with Obama, who famously called himself an organizer, a community organizer, and people were like, "What the hell is a community? What kind of job is that?" Mm-hmm. Well, for people who work for a living, it may sound weird, but on the left, it really is a job, community organizer. There are people who work for political parties and particularly for unions, and housing nonprofits. And their whole job is to go around and organize people, basically to create voting blocks. And this is what de Blasio did. He got involved in politics. He met his wife while working in the Dinkins administration. It's a curious story. His wife is at the time she was a lesbian, 7 years older than he is. She's a black woman. And she had written an article for Essence magazine called "I Am a Lesbian." She was a very fierce, black feminist lesbian, but this didn't dissuade de Blasio. He chased after her. And in fact,
there was no Me Too movement then, huh?
I guess not. I mean, she even reported, talking about it later, she said, yeah, he was really aggressive and he would try to steal kisses, and she had to put her foot down and say, "I'm not interested." I mean, this is the early 90s, which isn't that long ago, but,
it's funny you mention that because obviously she's a lesbian, she's a feminist. You talk about her and her, kind of that typical strain of black people, unfortunately, who get in great positions and get accomplished, and then they still decry the system because the system's unfair, even though they're benefited, kind of like Michelle Obama getting a full ride to Princeton and then saying Princeton is racist, So, but you write a great line about them, getting together. I call it a socialist marriage made in heaven, and they honeymoon in Cuba. And in the book you write, pandering aside, it's obvious that the de Blasio's, man and wife, were made for politics, is the part I love, because it is unclear that they could have made a living doing anything else.
I'm glad you caught that one.
No, but it's so perfect in a sense of regardless of your politics, because it sets up where we're going now. It sets up the whys of what has happened since he became mayor. So we got to get into the meat of this so people can learn beyond the headlines of what he's done. So now he somehow becomes the mayor of New York, and he gets, this is the biggest city in the country. He's the lick in his shop. It's like, I get to shape this clay the way I want it to. And in their mind, fix it for all the poor and all the black and brown people, right? Because that's what we want to do. So obviously, after 5, 6, 7 years, New York is perfect and everybody's living wonderful and loving the city, which we both know is not the case. So march us through the policies and the inactions and how we got here. So he becomes mayor and his policies. What are the things that he did that are different from Bloomberg and Giuliani before him?
Well, I mean, one of the first things they did was regarding public safety. Now, here's the thing about the police. Okay, it's true that the police tend to arrest more black and brown people, for want of a better term. I'm not black and Latinos, let's say, because that's really what it is. Black and Latino people. They do tend to arrest more of them. But at the same time, they don't arrest them strictly because of racism. They arrest them because they commit proportionally more crime. I mean, this is the type of thing that, anybody understands this, but it's kind of, for some reason, it's impossible to say. This isn't to say that all black people commit crime? Obviously they don't. 99% of them do not commit any crime.
Right.
But, of the people who commit crime, a disproportionate number of them are black and Latino. Now, you can get into the whys of that and the social roots and so forth. That's fine. But just in terms of actually arresting people and trying to stop crime, those are the facts on the ground. Mm-hmm. De Blasio took the approach that no. Any disparate impact in terms of policing and all of that must be due to racism.
I think that background of de Blasio gives us some great insight into how he governs and why New York has ended up the way it has. Coming up, more with Seth Barron, author of the new book, The Last Days of New York. You're listening to The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer.
Now, more of The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer, with your host, Charles Love.
Welcome back. I am continuing my conversation with Seth Barron, managing editor of The American Mind and author of the new book, The Last Days of New York. In the last segment, we talked about de Blasio's past and what led him to progressivism. But he ended that last segment talking about policing, and I wanted to dig into that a little bit further here and point out some of the hypocrisies of the people who claim to want to defund the police. And it's important to point out that you're talking pre-COVID, pre-George Floyd. So this is not the whole let's defund the police movement. He walked in the door after swearing in to office and said, let's stop this stuff from happening.
Yes, absolutely. So one of the first things they did was get rid of stop and frisk, which was, a program, maybe it went too far under Giuliani and Bloomberg, but the idea was you can stop people on the street and quickly frisk them.
And question, they'll leave the queue out.
And question, stop, question, and frisk, like, hi, what are you doing? If there's a basis for doing so, like a reasonable suspicion. Some people said it went too far. However, the point of it was to get guns off the street. And Ray Kelly, Bloomberg's police commissioner, you got to point out, he went out at the very beginning of Bloomberg's term in 2002. He went to all the black churches and he explained what he was going to do. He said, look, we're going to get guns off the street. And some people might not like it because I'm going to stop people to find out. And he got buy-in from the community. We've seen this time and time again, the drug war, in the 80s, the 70s.
Charlie Rangel asking Nixon, let's go all the way back to then. Hey, you need to do something about the...
I wasn't going to bring that up, but I'm glad you did. Yes, indeed. The black preachers and so forth in the 80s with the crack cocaine sentencing disparities, all of this came from or had support from, the bourgeois black community, the black silent majority, as it's been called. So Ray Kelly got buy-in on this. And they did take a lot of guns off the street. They did drive the murder rate down substantially. There were certain community elements that didn't like this and sued. Mm-hmm. And de Blasio went ahead and dropped the lawsuit and ended the practice. Now, things don't unwind immediately. So for a few years, we did see declining murder rates, although there was some fraying around the edges. He also eliminated penalties for public urination, for smoking marijuana, for being in parks after night, basically what you'd call quality of life crimes. Now, quality of life is really important for people in cities.
Especially when the density is so high.
There's so much density. People live in small apartments. They cherish their public space, like the parks and the sidewalks. So if those are threatening or dangerous, even if they're not actually dangerous, social scientists have demonstrated that even the appearance of disorder creates a chilling effect on just normal usage of public space. So if there's graffiti, if there's public drinking, if people are playing radios really loud, this type of activity, if people are allowed to urinate, people are allowed to sleep on the streets or be in the parks late. These types of activities chill normal use of property. And furthermore, they signal that disorder is tolerated. This is basically the broken windows theory.
In an effort to make things better for people and not have anybody stop for no reason, which I get, in an effort to make them more comfortable, you were willing, or de Blasio and others like him were willing to basically hurt the masses, which doesn't really seem to make sense.
That's right. And that's the funny thing. I mean, look, I started off saying, oh, well, Black and brown people commit most of the crime. That's only half the equation. Black and brown people are also most of the victims of the crime. And that's the important thing, that these communities, if you look at 911 data, most calls for the police come from poor neighborhoods. People are desperate for public safety in high crime neighborhoods. The police don't go out and say, we're going to go patrol all the Black neighborhoods in order to lock up Black people. They go and patrol the neighborhoods where there's a lot of crime.
Right. But here's a funny thing to the people you were talking about, recently after the pandemic and George Floyd. Let's go to the other side. I find it funny that we had at the same time, and you can attest to this or correct me if I'm wrong, a large percentage of the liberal New Yorkers saying we stand with the BLM people. We want to defund the police. But at the very same time that they were demanding fewer police and fewer arrests and let people out, no cash bails, these same people were encouraging people to call the police on people who weren't wearing masks, people who were shooting off fireworks, if we forget about that, and riding motorcycles around. And you remember where the Post ran an article about the woman, Shatavia Walls, who went to her neighbor asking them to stop firing off fireworks because that's what the borough president asked her to do. And she was killed for it. So isn't this just crazy that the same people saying, defund the police, we don't want this. And then we had record 911 calls in the non-poor areas. In Manhattan, we had record 911 calls.
Well, here's the thing. It's not like leftists really don't want the police. They just want the police called on the people they don't like.
Coming up, more with Seth Barron, author of the new book, The Last Days of New York. You're listening to The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer.
The Charles Love Show continues on AM 560, The Answer. Here's Charles Love.
Welcome back. I am continuing my conversation with Seth Barron, managing editor of The American Mind and author of the new book, The Last Days of New York. The book is available for pre-order and will be out at the beginning of June. In this segment, we talk about de Blasio's wife, mental health issues, and the homeless. Well, since you brought her up, we have to talk about Thrive New York City and how she lost hundreds of millions of dollars.
I just want to be fair to the de Blasio.
Well, she didn't lose it all.
She didn't lose it all. I want to be fair to the de Blasios in that she didn't. It's true that they don't really know where all the Thrive NYC money was spent. But part of that's the problem is that most of what Thrive NYC was just wrapping a new label around existing programs. Now, here's the thing. New York City does have a mental illness crisis, but the crisis is for people who are seriously mentally ill and untreated. Like, I'm talking about people who are schizophrenic or manic depressive who don't take their medicine. And that's a very small portion of the population. However, it's a very stubborn problem. And it's a difficult problem to treat because if people are resistant to taking their medicine, well, they have to be basically compelled to do so. But nobody likes to use force. And we've moved past the days of putting people in major mental hospitals and institutionalizing them. So this is a big problem. And this is the problem with mental illness in the streets of New York. You see people clearly out of their minds, wearing rags, sitting in their own filth, screaming, and then occasionally acting violently. The mentally ill, if they're treated, can live normal lives. Untreated, they can be a danger to themselves and others. Charlene McCray created a huge program called Thrive NYC, which ostensibly was dealing with mental illness, but it was really a program of mental wellness. So the idea was essentially to get more people into therapy. Now, say what you will about therapy. Maybe it's good. Maybe it's, whatever. It's not really the problem. Like anxiety mild depression. These aren't the main problems of mental illness in New York City. But at the same time, it's a lot easier to pretend to make strides in. It's very difficult to try to deal with the seriously mentally ill. And this is like her pet project. However, it is the case that, New York State has a very robust law for dealing with seriously mentally ill people who won't comply with a doctor's orders. It's called assisted outpatient treatment, where basically someone can be brought before a judge and the judge can say to them, if you don't take your medicine, you're going to be put in a hospital. And it's tremendously effective. And it's very robust, but unfortunately, it's underused. So the city has the tools available to it. It just chooses not to use them as vigorously as it could. So instead, you have people living on the streets, screaming, living in subway cars, occasionally going and doing like crazy things like stabbing people or beating someone. There was a fellow at the end of 2019 who went around Chinatown beating up homeless people, killed 4 people. He was mentally ill. He was known to the authorities. You have tragic cases like Sahil Vassell, who was running around the streets pointing a pipe at people in their faces like it was a gun, and he was shot by the police. All of these cases, people like this are generally known to the authorities. So there's no excuse for this to happen. Unfortunately, we're seeing more and more of it, and it's largely because de Blasio and the progressives refuse to deal with it. Here's a question. Say you're just like some heartless libertarian capitalist, and you don't care what happens to other people, and you see someone lying in their own filth and you just walk over them every day. Or if you're like a very caring socialist progressive and you see someone lying like that every day and you just think, well, they're allowed to live their life too, and we can't bother them. Like, what's the difference? At what point does caring and not caring dovetail? So it seems like there is a reasonable middle ground where we can recognize that some people are unable to care for themselves, and we have to use some government intervention to get people off the streets and get them cared for.
So obviously it is a problem. Something needs to be done, but the powers that be must not know even what direction to go in, because de Blasio doubled the budget, but homelessness is worse. What's the problem?
There's 2 different types of homelessness in New York City. There's people who are homeless and in the system, which means that they live in shelters, and then there's the unsheltered. Most of the money that is spent on homelessness is for sheltering people, most of whom are families. What we're really talking about are single mothers with children. Actually, those numbers have gone down. It was up to 70,000. I think it's down to 60,000. And that's gone down because of so much money has been poured into getting them to subsidized housing. And then there's the street homeless. And that's who we're talking about. Yes, it has gotten worse. New York City has not gotten to the point of one thing de Blasio has refused to do, which other mayors have not, is he does not permit tents. They will not permit people to set up tents or build structures on the street. No, but it's bad. And a lot of it overlaps with the mental illness.
The homeless problem really irks me because the solution is simple, but we don't want to do what needs to be done. Go pick up my book, We Want Equality, and I lay it out for you clearly. Coming up, my final segment with Seth Barron, author of The Last Days of New York. You're listening to The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer.
You like me and I like you.
The Charles Love Show continues on AM 560, The Answer. Here's Charles Love.
Welcome back. We have reached our final segment with Seth Barron, managing editor at The American Mind and author of the new book, The Last Days of New York. Available for pre-order, released at the beginning of June. And We talk about all the problems in New York, the crime, the homelessness, the overspending, the policies, people leaving the city. So I was all ready for Seth to tie it in a nice, neat bow and give us all the solutions for New York City. So I asked him, what do we do? And here's the final segment of our interview. So I guess we got to leave it with it's the last days of New York, the book, and you don't want it to all end. So where do we go? I mean, we got the problems that you write about in the book of the one-party rule, and regardless of what party that is, that tends to be bad because people get carte blanche to what they want to do. So where do you see this ending up?
I mean, that's the problem, Charles, is, we've essentially had all of these politicians choosing their own electorate because they drive out anyone who can't stand it. And all you've got left is these people who seem to like the direction things are going. I mean, they might not like it getting hit on the head, but, I don't know what they're going to do to change it. I don't see any of the new crop of mayoral candidates doing much. The new city council that's going to come in is going to be far more left. The Democratic Socialists are, they're roaring to go. Right. Unless there's significant change in the will of the people, I don't see things changing. I see things getting worse.
Well, I got an agreement with a different end. I see things getting better after they get worse. So I think you're right. I think the only change would be if the populace said something about it. And most of them have been checked out. And I mean the people who can't afford to leave. I think it will happen, but it's got to get worse first. I mean, we see the uproar all the time of the people saying, de Blasio, do something about this. Slashing. It went from pushing people on the tracks weekly to punching women in the face weekly to now slashings. So at some point, the regular folk, when everything opens back up, the regular folk are going to have to go back to work. They are not going to take too kindly with being attacked on the subway every day. So it's a matter of time, I think.
I hope so, but things can get really bad before they get better.
Yeah, they will get really bad. They will get bad before they get better. And I don't want it to, and I'm not wishing it, but I just think that's the only way you get the average person to speak up, because we're all selfish. An average person will watch TV and say, that's so unfortunate. But, let me crunch the numbers. It's still less likely that it'll happen to me. I'm okay. But when they start seeing stuff on the regular, they will do it. But I don't know how much further down we can go. And when you go too far down, it becomes harder to fix it. I understand that.
That's
but
the problem.
I was hoping you were going to give me, it's the last days, that the book was going to, because I was only 85% done. I was hoping it was going to end with, we have all the solutions with sunny blue skies and sun. You're killing me, Seth. But maybe we do a follow-up and you'll have all the answers.
I hope so.
He is Seth Barron, managing editor of The American Mind and author of the new book, The Last Days of New York. This has been a great conversation. I appreciate it. And thank you for your time.
Thank you, Charles.